Welcome. We were having a little microphone, but is this okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you for coming out in this crazy weather. It's a great chance to see all of you again. I'm sorry I missed all of you at the January one because I was in East Aurora under 90 inches of snow. I didn't make that up, that's what they reported. Wendy carried on, and I was wonderful that so many still could join. Today we're going to be hearing Dr. James Maynard. He says to call him Jim. And it's going to be a great program. We always start with our lunch first, so without any more to do, we'll start with lunch and enjoy conversation with each other, and I'll be back to introduce Dr. Maynard. Thank you.
But I love and I love and you love Mozart, did you say? No. Yeah. So I don't and I love
So it's in a good position. She wants these recorded. How was everybody's lunch? Well, she'll come around and ask if you want more coffee and tea, and then you can finish your dessert. I'm about to introduce Dr. James Maynard, who is the Associate Curator of UB's Poetry Collection, the Library of Record for 20th and 21st Century Anglophone Poetry. Dr. Maynard has written extensively on the poet Robert Duncan. His most recent editorial project, an edition of Duncan's collected essays and other prose, received the Poetry Foundation's 2014 Pegasus Award for Poetry Criticism. And he's going to be talking more in detail of everything, the wonderful things he does. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Maynard.
So how am I on the mic? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
How about that? Is it better? Better?
Yes.
Okay, well if I fade out or it cuts out, someone just throw a roll at me or something. Oh, okay. A plate then, how about a plate?
No.
Thank you, Maureen. I'd like to thank you and Jill Robbins and Karen Carlton for setting up today's event, and especially to all of you for coming out on what's of course another cold and snowy Buffalo afternoon. As Lorraine said, my name is James Maynard, and I'm the Associate Curator of the Poetry Collection. I'm also a UP alum. I came here to do a PhD in the English department, which I received in spring of 2007. I was invited today to share with you some information about the Poetry Collection, and especially its world-renowned holdings, which really are some of Buffalo's best great cultural treasures. It is always a pleasure for me discussing the Poetry Collection with new audiences because I realize, despite our worldwide reputation, we're not always widely known by people, even UB alums in Western New York. So I'm just sort of curious here at the outset, just by a show of hands, how many of you before today had any kind of familiarity with the Poetry Collection? Okay, so we're doing our job, the numbers are increasing. Well, if we have a chance actually afterwards, I'd actually be curious to hear sort of what your past experiences were. I'm going to try and juggle the mic here with our presentation, so if you'll bear with me. because for some of you this will be a new presentation, what I thought I would do then as a kind of introduction is to talk generally about the history of the poetry collection before looking specifically at two of our more renowned collections, an older collection, our James Joyce collection, and then a more recent collection, our Victor E. Reichert Robert Frost collection. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about some of our recent and noteworthy projects. Two federal grant projects we've been working on, our participation in last year's Dylan Thomas Centennial Celebration in Wales, and two new endowment projects that I'm very excited about. And then I'd like to end by just briefly talking about some of our needs for continuing additional support, and then what I'd really like to do is to open it up for question and answer. So really, I could be here for about 3 weeks talking about what we do in all of our various collections. I love talking about our various collections, but I've been told I only have 30 to 45 minutes here today. So hopefully what I don't get to address here, we can talk about in some form or fashion afterwards. Let's begin then at the beginning. The poetry collection was founded in 1937 by Charles David Abbott, but its roots really go back to Thomas B. Lockwood and his two significant gifts to the University of Buffalo. First, the major gift that made possible the construction of the Lockwood Memorial Library, and secondly, his donation of his really stellar rare books collection. And I love these old pictures of the library. There are these wonderful pictures in the university archives of the library in 33 and 34 being constructed. And in some of the photographs, it's really remarkable to see because it's the only building you see in that vista of campus, which is hard to imagine today. So in the early 1930s, Thomas B. Lockwood, a wealthy Buffalo businessman and attorney, gave a major gift to the university which made possible the construction of the first university libraries. It opened in 1935, and it opened as the Lockwood Memorial Library, dedicated to Lockwood's father and his wife's father. His father was Daniel Lockwood, congressman, Democratic congressman from the state of New York, and his wife, Marion Lockwood, was Marion Burge Lockwood of the Burge wallpaper family in Buffalo, and George K. Burge was her father. So you'll see, and we still have this in the university archives, the original dedication plaque, which is a beautiful, beautiful piece. Really what fewer people probably know about, however, is Lockwood's collection of rare books that he donated to the university. As a wealthy businessman and attorney, Lockwood was also a great lover of books, and he had amassed one of the great early 20th century book collections in the United States. We're talking about some of the most collectible and valuable books in the history of Western bookmaking. So all four folios of Shakespeare, going back to 1623, first editions of Milton's Paradise Lost, title pages you can see here, Spenser's The Fairy Queen, Origin of the Species, first privately published edition of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. It is a remarkable collection of some of the most spectacular publications that you can imagine. But it's not what you would necessarily call deep in any one area. It's a collector's collection. So there are many of these spectacular first and other editions, but it's not a collection that would say facilitate the long-term or deep study of all of Milton or all of Shakespeare or all of Spenser. When he gave these two gifts to the university, Lockwood was also instrumental in recruiting the first director of the university libraries, a man named Charles David Abbott. Abbott had been teaching in Buffalo in the faculty of the English department. He'd left to take a position at University of Colorado, and Lockwood was very instrumental in recruiting him back to take up a joint role in both the library as director and as professor of English. And one of the ways that they were able to do this is that they gave him an opportunity to create his own research collection. And what Abbott wanted to do was he wanted to create a library collection, a research collection, that would in many ways extend both the tradition of fine press books and printing that was evident in Lockwood's collection, but he wanted to make a collection that was complementary in the fact that whereas the Lockwood collection of rare books is selective, being a collector's collection, Abbott wanted to create something that was truly going to be inclusive and comprehensive for research. So we're thinking here at this point in the mid-1930s. And so Abbott thought to himself, well, what can I begin collecting that is not going to be so rare that it's going to be unavailable on the market, what's not going to be so valuable that it will be prohibitively expensive, and finally, what do I, as a person and a scholar, love enough to begin collecting in this inclusive and exhaustive way? And his answer in the 1930s, and our answer still today, is what he originally called the Modern Poetry Project. And what Abbott wanted to do was he wanted to create a collection that would facilitate the deepest possible research for scholars of the future so that they could come to Buffalo and study any aspect of any given Anglophone poet's writing after 1900. So we're talking about 20th and now 21st century poetry in English and some English translation. And what Abbott wanted to do was he wanted to really create what he imagined as a laboratory for the imagination. He wanted to create a collection that would allow a scholar to come and basically to study any given poet's creativity, what makes that poet unique from all others writing at that given time in history. And so to do this, his notion was that he would put together a collection that would allow one to study every change, be it large or be it small, that takes place in a given poet's work from the very beginning of their writing life to the very end. And if you think about it, some of these changes can be quite dramatic. The most popular, critically and otherwise, poets have a number of books, a number of editions of their books, selected works, collected works, posthumous publications, and oftentimes there's a great variety of editing and revision that takes place in that. And Abbott wanted to create something that would allow and make possible the study of those changes over time, what he thought of as the psychology of creativity. So how is he going to do that? Well, in the first couple years of the collection, it really began somewhat organically, and it evolved as he found out, and in the process of making the collection, discovered what in fact he wanted to do. So the first area of collecting, and still our main area of collecting, is what we consider to be first and other bibliographically significant editions of modern and now contemporary poetry. So what do I mean by that? Well, anytime a new book comes out, a new edition by a poet, that is in some ways bibliographically different from what has preceded it, we will collect it. So oftentimes if a book comes out 25 years later, 10 years later, different anniversary editions, it's very common for poets to change things. Writers are oftentimes never satisfied with their work. So they will add new poems. They'll remove poems. They'll put a new introduction in. They'll make new additions, changes to their text. And it was that transmission history, what's called genetic studies, that Abbott wanted to put together the library collection. Now, what we don't collect are multiple printings of the same book. So if you think of something like Allen Ginsberg's Howl, 1956 from City Lights Books in San Francisco, that book is still in print today, having gone through probably something like 60 or 70 different printings. But each multiple printing is exactly the same as what's preceded it, so there's no value from a research point of view in doing multiple printings. But as there have been different anniversary editions of Howl, and different introductions to the work, different conclusions, different people have added commentaries, every new edition of the book we add to the collection. As he was putting together this collection, however, it soon became apparent to Abbott that if he really wanted to put together this laboratory to study the entire arc of a poet's writing activities, that he was missing out on some very important material. And that is what we refer to still today as little magazines. So these are magazines usually non-commercial in nature. They're not meant to garner any editor fame or fortune, except perhaps the literary kind. And they're oftentimes committed to certain literary ideals, oftentimes common ideas about poetry, oftentimes common ideals about politics, and oftentimes common ideals about both. These are magazines that are oftentimes printed in very small numbers by a particular group of people in a particular place for a certain known audience. And that's really the term little. It doesn't have to do with their format, although oftentimes they are quarto in size. But really what it has to do is it refers to their circles of distribution. So these little magazines are meant to be published and handed around, distributed to little audiences of known and identified readers. And you're all reading the same magazines because you share the same beliefs as the editor and the poets about what kind of poetry one should be reading. And so there's an entire level of activity that takes place in these magazines before most poets even have their first book projects. And that's still the case today. A lot of this activity has gone online in terms of online poetry magazines and blogs, but there are still hundreds of print magazines taking shape every day. And one of the things that happens for a lot of poets is that this becomes oftentimes a testing ground for their work. So before they know who they are as poets and before they know what kind of verse they want to craft, they're testing things out in the magazines. So you can get some very interesting variations between, say, what a piece will look like in a magazine versus its eventual shape and form in a publication. And finally, in hindsight, this was really Abbott's greatest gift to us today, and it is truly the mark of his genius, is that in the 1930s, he decided that he was going to start collecting literary papers and manuscripts, what he called worksheets. And really, he is widely credited as being the first person to begin collecting this material for its research value, for its intellectual value, for literary scholars, and to do so on an institutional level. There were other collectors, usually individuals. One thinks of someone like John Quinn for James Joyce, but these are people collecting manuscripts by their favorite authors because of their association value. Abbott wanted to do it for research value. And what he wanted was, he didn't want what we call, even still today, fair copies. So oftentimes when you're working with paper drafts, you might have 2 or 3 different versions of a manuscript, and then to incorporate all those into a new draft going forward, you write it out by hand or you type it up, and it's a nice, neat new copy that incorporates all those changes. That's not what Abbott wanted. What he wanted were all these messy strike-throughs and the emendations and the marginalia. He wanted to have as much material evidence of the poet thinking through words on paper as possible, because here, he thought, was where you could get closest to the intent and the mind of the poet. Here you could get closest to their creative process, their revisionary habits, and what made them unique from all other writers. In the very beginning, Abbott's notion was just to collect representative samples of poets' work. So the idea that we have today of collecting someone's entire archive, in the beginning of the collection, that was not so much the plan. Instead, he was writing to poets and just asking them for, send me representative manuscripts, worksheets that show your working habits. It was really about a decade later that the practice of doing whole archives came about. Also, in the very beginning, if you can believe that, and it's hard looking back today to think this, but in the very beginning, Abbott's other practice was to collect manuscripts only on donation. This was a very different time in terms of literary history, in terms of what financial value these materials had. So he was able to write to poets, Marion Moore, William Carlos Williams, Wallace Stevens, Ezra Pound, and he literally asked them for the contents of their trash cans. Those process documents that you throw away, I think they're going to have research value for scholars of the future, and I want you to send them to Buffalo. And people did. His other real great gift, I think, and this is where he was quite insightful, was he involved the poets themselves in the process of building the collection. So as I said, he wrote to them. He had a small group in the beginning of American and English poets that he started to solicit for manuscripts. He had poets come to Western New York. He had poets visit the university. He had poets stay in his house. He had married into the Gratwick family, which is out in Pavilion, New York, Wyoming County. The family still owns the house. It's now operated completely privately, but they do open it up every June for a tree peony festival. It's a beautiful place. I absolutely recommend it. And Abbott would have poets come and stay on the property. So someone like William Carlos Williams probably stayed 7 or 8 different times. In fact, he had probably his first stroke in Western New York. And by doing this, he got poets to care about the collection, and he gave them a stake in its amassing. He made them part of the process. So, flash forward 78 years. Today we are the poetry collection of the university libraries, and we're one of the largest poetry libraries in the world, and the library of record for 20th and 21st century Anglophone poetry. Again, poetry in English. And I just want to take a moment, if I can, and affirm the magnitude of what Abbott set out to do. I mean, if you think about it, we're talking about all the poetry that gets produced in English. So we're not just talking about North America, but also the UK, also South Africa, New Zealand, Australia. It is, I can tell you, a perversely impossible ideal that he set out to do. It's hard enough to collect all the work that takes place in Western New York, much less the rest of the world. But that is in some ways the beauty of the project, is that it has this very grand scope of it. And Abbott, from the beginning, had this sense that he was not just making this collection for scholars of the future, but he also wanted to make the most comprehensive collection that he could, because he wanted to be able to create for scholars, for students, poets and makers, a total depiction of what was going on in the field of poetry at any one given historical moment. It's a monumental project. So today, these are some brief statistics about what we have in terms of our holdings. At this point in time, we have more than 140,000 poetry titles, so these first and other bibliographically significant editions, including approximately 7,000 broadsides. These are poems, usually more visual in their orientation, that are published on larger sheets of paper, usually for some kind of public ceremonial occasion, as well as an extensive selection of anthologies, criticism, reference books, audio recordings, and ephemera. And again, the idea is that if you come to Buffalo to study a poet, so if you're interested as a scholar in T.S. Eliot, or Robert Frost, or Langston Hughes, then you can come to our collection and you can get all the materials that you might possibly need for your research. So books and other editions, but also biographical materials, also secondary sources and criticism, and in the best of cases, also the literary manuscripts that inform the work that gets published. We now have more than 9,000 past and current little magazine titles. These are not 9,000 issues of different magazines. These are over 9,000 different titles. We have 150 manuscript collections, including the world's largest archive of James Joyce papers, along with major collections from William Carlos Williams, Wyndham Lewis, Robert Graves, Robert Duncan, Helen Adam, Dylan Thomas, and many more. And I should also mention that over the decades, we've become something of a regional repository for a lot of the arts and cultural organizations of Western New York. So we hold, if not the entire archive, then at least partial archives for groups like Hall Walls, for Just Buffalo, and for SIBA. We have private libraries of certain poets, like Joyce, Helen Adam, Robert Duncan, and Basil Bunting. We have a large collection of artworks. Poetry and painting for centuries have been sister arts. We have a number of works by Salvador Dali, Constantine Brancusi, Jess Collins, Wyndham Lewis, E.E. Cummings, and others. And then we also have, rounding out the collection and supplementing it, all kinds of other materials that weren't really part of Abbott's original collecting parameters, but which inform poetry scholars by having different kinds of historical or bibliographic information connected to them. So we have a large collection of audio recordings, of different kinds of ephemera, things that were handed away, transient, never meant to last, as well as collections of mail art, visual and concrete poetry, photographs, and more recently, what are known as zines, kind of a more recent publishing phenomenon. So what else do we do? We collect a lot of stuff. This is true. Today, the Poetry Collection continues its mission of acquiring comprehensively the publications, and in many cases the papers, of writers located at both the center and the margins of poetic culture. An active research center for the study of all facets of modern contemporary poetry, each year the collection continues to collect inclusively and without prejudice for future scholars, while trying to serve the needs of today's literary researchers. And I want to make a brief note here. And this goes back to Abbott's original vision. So what we continue to do as curators is we do not see it to be our jobs to define what poetry is. Instead, we're trying to collect the sum total of what gets produced under the name of poetry. So if someone is publishing something somewhere and calling it poetry, we'll do our very best to collect it. And believe me, I could have brought lots of samples of things that you might not agree were poetry. Poetry in shoes, poetry on objects, books that are meant to be destroyed, all kinds of things. And the emphasis for doing that is because it is very hard to predict the whims of literary fortune. So if you shape a collection now, you are likely to lose someone who might be of interest in 5, 10, or 50 years. So by trying to collect as much as we can, depending upon what scholarship does evolve, we'll likely have some kind of material basis to allow people to study that in the future. We also, I should say, support a wide variety of publications with our materials. So book projects, biographies, edited projects, monographs, articles. People oftentimes come to us for their literary research, and so our materials and our collections get cited all the time in different kinds of publications. One of our other primary tasks is to assist with the educational activities of UB and other schools in Western New York and elsewhere. And I say elsewhere because I've actually had a William Carlos Williams grad class from Albany come and spend their spring break in Buffalo, of all places, so that the class could do the research on Williams. We were once going to have a class come from Detroit, but I have a feeling that the English department chairperson discovered at the last minute what this faculty member was doing by driving undergraduates into Canada, because it's a closer way than coming stateside, and that trip was canceled at the last minute. But we do have people come from all over. We welcome prominent U.S. and international scholars and students. One of the most fantastic parts of my job is that I never know on a daily basis who's going to walk in the front door or call on the phone. We've got people come from all over Europe and Asia, and of course the United States. We participate in various events in the local literary communities. We have a table every year at the Buffalo Small Press Book Fair. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we co-sponsored a screening of a Robert Frost documentary as part of a film series at Hallwalls Contemporary Arts Center in downtown Buffalo. And we loan items to exhibitions around the world. I'll talk a little bit more about some of our Dylan Thomas loans as an example of that. And finally, we host numerous lectures, conferences, readings, and other events. So really at this point in time, we're kind of a strange amalgam. We're part poetry library, we're part manuscript special collection, we're part art gallery. And if you will walk into our space, and I hope you will, you'll see all kinds of things on the walls that you might not expect. And because of that, we really think of ourselves as a research center, all aspects of the study of modern and now contemporary poetry and English. 2 collections that I wanted to just mention briefly here today, because these oftentimes are questions that we get questions about. Our James Joyce collection, and more recently our Victor E. Reichert Robert Frost collection. And I wanted to focus on these 2 because the Joyce collection is an older one, whereas the Reichert one, and you can find more information about that in the issue of UB Libraries Today that are on the tables, is a very recent one, but one we are most pleased about. There's our friend James Joyce, always looking very dapper in his photographs. On the left and on the far right, he's pictured with Sylvia Beach, his publisher of Ulysses in Paris. She ran the publishing house / bookstore Shakespeare and Company, and when no one else would take on the task of publishing his scandalous and avant-garde text Ulysses, she was the one who made sure that the book came into life. And I think by all accounts, if you were to take a stock or an inventory of the most influential text of the 20th century, usually Ulysses comes up first upon that list. Our James Joyce collection is the largest collection of Joyce's manuscripts in the world. I can't say that enough. It's bigger than the collection at the Ransom Center in Texas, bigger than Princeton, bigger than Cornell, bigger than the National Library of Ireland in Dublin. Highlights include his private library, manuscripts, corrected galleys, and page proofs for Ulysses. There are 66 notebooks known to exist for his late difficult work, Finnegan's Wake, and they're all in Buffalo. Documents for early works, such as a portrait of the artist as a young man in Exiles, as an early play. Hundreds of letters between Sylvia, Beach, and Joyce. Beach's printing records for the publication of Ulysses. Joyce's presentation copies to Beach. Portraits and over 150 photographs of Joyce and his family, many of which you will see in a Joyce alcove that we have hanging up in the collection. As well as numerous personal artifacts owned by Joyce, including his canes and glasses. We have people who come all over the world just to see what they consider to be holy relics of Joyce. As well as notebooks, sketchbooks, and letters by Joyce's daughter, Lucia Joyce, who was very influential in Joyce's late writings. Everybody wants to know the question, why Buffalo? how did this stuff end up in Buffalo? You'll have to have me come back sometime for a separate conversation just about that. But briefly, the collection has come to us over the span of the decades in 6 main acquisition waves from 4 different sources. So 1 came from the family in 1949, 2 came from Joyce's New York publisher, B.W. Hubish, 2 came from his publisher, Sylvia Beach. Actually, there's a wonderful photograph of her receiving an honorary degree from UB in 1958. And a last batch came in the 60s from Maria Jola, who, with her husband Eugene, edited the little magazine Transition and published some late installments of Joyce's works. This is, without doubt, the crown jewel of our collection. And my favorite story about the collection is, in the beginning, this is 1949 we're talking about. This is 8 years after Joyce passed away. His family was trying to raise some money for themselves in post-war Europe. And the way they were going to do that is they were going to put a large portion of their personal collections, so his manuscripts, the paintings, his personal effects, put them up on exhibition in Paris at the Galerie Lehun, and then at the end of the exhibition to auction it off. Well, Oscar Silverman, of great UB fame and fortune, another great person both in terms of the library's history and the English departments, he saw this exhibition. He contacted Abbott and said, I think this is a wonderful collection that we should have for our growing poetry collection. And it was a closed bid process. And when they unwrapped all the bids, Buffalo just happened to have the highest bid. So, as is many things in life, it was a great deal of coincidence and luck, but also a great deal of foresight and knowledge, and people knowing what should be done when the time comes. And I'm very glad they did this. So certainly there's lots more to talk about in terms of the Joyce collection, and I'll be happy to do so in the question and answer period if time allows. And I should say too that many of our collections really have a history of local philanthropy in Western New York. So this collection in particular was only possible because of many kind donors, but particularly because of 2 Buffalo families, the Wixers and the Staffords, both of whom allowed major portions of this archive to come to Buffalo. The other collection I want to talk about is our more recent collection, the Victor E. Reichert Robert Frost collection. This is a picture on the left of Victor and Frost in Ohio, and of course, slightly older Frost on the right. My parents take a great interest in what I do, of course, but most of the collections that I talk about with them don't really garner that much interest from them. That's very nice, they'll say, or I'm very happy for the collection. But when I told them we were getting a Robert Frost collection, that's all they could talk about for a while. Really, I can't think of an American poet of his generation that is more iconic and more well-known than Robert Frost. Frost is really one of these writers whose identity transcends what they actually accomplished, so that people can tell you, if you were asked somebody on the street, who was Robert Frost, they can tell you he was a poet without knowing a single poem that he actually ever wrote. So this collection in particular has garnered us a lot of great publicity. It was in a number of newspapers when the gift came about. It was even published in a little radio spot on NPR's Morning Edition 2 years ago. And it too has a great story. So Victor Reichert was rabbi of the Rockdale Avenue Temple in Cincinnati, Ohio from 1938 to 1962 and shared a long friendship with Frost. As it turned out, Frost was a poet who was very much interested in spiritual matters, and Rabbi Reichert was a rabbi who was definitely interested in all things poetic. In 1946, Reichert invited Frost to present a sermon, and in 1960 he was instrumental in awarding Frost an honorary doctorate at Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion. And I forget how many dozen of honorary doctorates that Frost received, but it's an astounding number. Their relationship is documented in Andrew Marx's book, The Rabbi and the Poet. Victor Reichert, whom I know some of you in the room know, was an avid, or his son, Jonathan. Victor was an avid Frost collector, and his collection passed to his son, Dr. Jonathan Reichert, professor emeritus in physics, who donated it to us in 2012. In general, the Reichert Frost collection contains many signed and inscribed publications by Frost. They really had most of their personal relationship conducted in person. Frost was living in Ripton, Vermont. The Reicherts had a vacation home in Ripton, Vermont, and so most of their time was spent on the back porch, talking about God, talking about poetry. And so most of this collection is a documentation of their friendship as it took place outside of those summers in Ripton. There's a Frost manuscript, and many of Reichert's manuscripts and notes on Frost, as well as letters, photographs, audio recordings, ephemera, and many Frost-related items from other critics. There are several projects that I'm most proud of from the past couple of years. And in brief, I want to talk about a few of them here today. In particular, 2 national grants that we've been working on, one finished and one ongoing. Our participation in the Dylan Thomas Centenary, which was last year. And lastly, 2 new endowments that I'm happy to announce. One, actually, I probably shouldn't announce, but I'm going to announce it anyway, because it's brand new.
Okay.
Don't tell anyone, okay? One of the many ways we've been able to expand our resources is through various different kinds of corporate and foundation support. In 2007, we received a $202,241 grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities for the Preservation and Access Program. And currently we're working on a grant from the Council on Libraries and Information Resources, what they call their Cataloging Hidden Special Collections and Archives grant. All collections like ours have various different kinds of backlog. So the more successful we are, the more collections we acquire, and the more work there is to do for archivists. We have work for people for centuries. They're not here, so I can say that.
I was going to say, are you hiring?
Not as much as I would like. The work is the job security, I think they call it. There is much of that. So the first of these is a project that we're now calling Here at Buffalo. So this award from the NEH allowed us to reformat, catalog, and make accessible over 1,300 endangered cassette and reel-to-reel audio recordings of poetry materials from a number of different reasons. We had just boxes of recordings on cassette and reel-to-reel, and in most cases, we didn't even know what was on them. And particularly in the case of the reel-to-reel recordings, we couldn't even play them to find out what was there. So what this grant allowed us to do was allowed us to work with a sound preservation studio outside of Philadelphia. We shipped everything to them. They digitized and, when necessary, preserved some of the materials. Reel-to-reel in particular is a very unstable medium. So actually, even under archival conditions, like we have in our closed stacks, it gets what's called sticky shed syndrome. So sometimes the magnetic leader separates from its backing. And the way they actually have to fix this is by putting it, this sounds counterintuitive, but the way they actually fix this is by putting it into a low temperature oven and by baking it. And that helps the backing re-adhere. Not cheap work though. Dating between 1962 and 2000, the recordings that we worked with fall into 3 categories. An archive of tapes from poetry readings, lectures, and other unique events that took place in the poetry collection and on the University of Buffalo campus or elsewhere in Western New York, like this Robert Creeley reading represented by the poster there. Personal recordings that poets made of their own readings over a library of time. And what we consider these to be is essentially an audio version of manuscripts so that you could document how a poet's reading of their own work changed over time. Because like with written manuscripts, there can be quite great variety. And finally, libraries of tapes collected by various individuals and groups. And the result of this project was really quite remarkable. Capturing readings, lectures, interviews, conferences, and other literary events, these tapes really document the development of different kinds of innovative avant-garde poetries and their communities throughout the second half of the 20th century. And particularly relevant for us, they also document Buffalo's role within that history. One of the great things from my position is that everyone I've always been interested in terms of poetry has either been, is coming, or at some point will come to Buffalo. It really is a capital for poetry. And I don't know if enough people in the city actually realize how much history there is to back that up. This grant, we're almost about, well, maybe about 8 months into. We applied for this Cataloging Hidden Collections grant, as I said, as a way of catching up with some of our backlog. So the formal name for this project was Processing the Editorial and Business Records of 11 Little Magazine Archives in the Poetry Collection. And essentially what it is these were 11 hidden collections. So these are collections that we identified as having prominent value for the humanities research, but that were completely unknown to scholars outside of Buffalo. Many of them were still packed in the boxes in which they were shipped here decades ago. So what this project allowed us to do, it allowed us to hire a project archivist, someone coming in to work just on this project, and to work with a variety of graduate student assistants in terms of processing this. And then eventually to make these records available online for researchers. It's not enough anymore just to catalog things, but you have to be very zealous and forthright about making it available online, because that's what everybody wants to see. Ranging in date from 1960 to 2010, and representing different literary communities across the country, these archives will have an immediate impact on scholarship in the fields of post-World War II literary and cultural studies. And I should say that in terms of backlog, it's not an exaggeration that our poor project archivist is working on about 273 linear feet of material. Job security. If you have a chance, and you're down in the Elmwood Village area, you should pick up a copy of the newest issue of Block Club. I'll pass one around here if you want to take a look at it. There's a remarkable story in here that the editor did. He was interested in archives. This is actually an issue that's themed binge and purge. I won't comment on choice of topics. But there's a great story on the poetry collection, and in particular on this project, and a profile of the archivist who's working on it. So it's really about her work, and in general about the significance of historical memory, and how that only takes place when there's an archive like this kept in catalog. So I'll pass this around, but it's a nice little piece that's out there right now in the community. As I said earlier, really as a museum of poetry, which is what we essentially are at this point, we loan a lot of our materials to exhibitions around the world. Last year, as part of a year-long centennial celebration of Dylan Thomas's birth, born in 1914, so the 100th anniversary, the poetry collection loaned materials from its Dylan Thomas collection to exhibitions at the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, and the Dylan Thomas Center in Swansea, which is where the poet was born. In June, myself and our curator, Michael Pasinski, had the opportunity to travel over to Wales to tour both exhibitions. And I can't tell you what a pleasure this was in terms of seeing how the country of Wales received this material coming back. This is cultural legacy for them. The entire plan of the Dylan Thomas Centenary was geared in many ways to help drive some cultural tourism back to the country. And essentially, Thomas is to Wales what Joyce is to Ireland. So it was a year-long celebration all throughout the country, various kinds of conferences and symposia, and performances and readings and book publications. And it was a real blast to go over and see how they hosted these materials in their exhibitions. So the heart of our collection are a number of notebooks that young Dylan wrote in his teenage years in his parents' bedroom in the Uplands district of Swansea. And this became the material that really informed his first 2 or 3 books of poetry. He would keep going back and reharvesting his earlier writings. And these notebooks were seen as a homecoming coming back to Swansea. There are all kinds of UK coverage. The BBC covered it. There's a couple documentaries that feature our materials as part of this centennial. And it was really quite astonishing to see. You know, sometimes you have to leave the collection to understand its value. And this was certainly for me one of those opportunities. I had given all of you copies of our holiday card from this year. And this was always a fun project to work on. So our contribution to the Dylan Thomas Centenary was to publish from our archive one of the poems that you can see, both in terms of its book publication and also how it appears in its manuscript in our collection. So this is from one of those adolescent notebooks I had mentioned as being the significant heart of our Dylan Thomas collection. And the cover that you see is one of 2 paintings that we have by the Canadian-born but now longtime resident of Wales painter Gordon Thomas Stewart. This was painted just weeks before Thomas's death in the early 50s when he came to New York and passed away. And both of these paintings are currently being preserved for us at the Buffalo State Conservation Lab. we've had a very prosperous partnership with. So they're not going to be back until probably the fall, but they're really quite beautiful pieces. And it was quite a journey for these manuscripts. And actually, I should mention too. Do any of you receive At Buffalo? Well, selfishly, not only am I and our curator written about in the story, but it was my wife who wrote the cover story. So, as I said, it was really a great opportunity to travel over and to see these joint exhibitions. And Lauren was our de facto documentarian. She works for, actually across the parking lot, she works in Crofts Hall as a writer and editor for University News Services. So she was assigned to cover it. So we came back with all kinds of story ideas and about 800 photographs. And I have a copy, if you haven't seen it, I'll just pass this around too. But the reason why I mention that is because these materials were personally couriered over to Wales by one of the exhibition officers from the National Library of Wales. And they will be coming back in a few weeks, in the beginning to mid of March. And we're hoping to have a party and put some of these materials on exhibition. So if you're interested in coming and seeing some of this material as kind of a follow-up celebration of the centennial, by all means let me know and we'll put you on the invite list. I'm also happy to announce, as I said, 2 recent endowments. The first is the Jonathan F. Reichert Fund to support the Victor E. Reichert Robert Frost collection. This was a first for me, to be honest. In addition to donating his father's Frost collection, Jonathan also came to us a few months later, after the gift was formally processed in December of 2012, with a challenge, he said. An opportunity, I believe he called it. And he challenged us that summer.
Knowing Jonathan, yes.
If you know Jonathan, you'll understand. His challenge to us was that if we could raise $15,000 to support the long-term sustainability of his father's collection, he would match that with a $50,000 gift of his own. Well, we all sprung into action, started writing our letters and making our phone calls. I'm happy to say that we raised the money in under 3 months. And so now there is an endowment to support this collection. Our second endowment, which I put an asterisk next to because it's not formally created yet, is what we're calling a Friends of the Poetry Collection Fund. So with the help of numerous donors, we've been able to raise over $25,000 in the past few years to create a new Friends of the Poetry Collection endowment. And like the Reichert Frost Fund, this will allow us to support new acquisitions, as well as special projects such as publications and member events. And I say, it hasn't been quite established yet because we're still needing to work out the parameters of the fund and its spending limits, but it's in the works. I end with these two because despite all of our successes, or perhaps because of them, the poetry collection is always in need of additional support. In an era when state funds for public education are always in jeopardy, our long-term future will be best served by private support, and especially by the autonomy that endowed funds will allow us to have. So currently, there are a number of different ways that people who are interested in our mission, who are interested in our contribution to the state of Anglophone poetry, can make. First is quite simple, what we call gifts in kind. These are gifts of material. So if any of you have Robert Frost manuscripts in your attics at home, please give me a call this afternoon. Now, that's probably not the case, but what is oftentimes more the case is that people will have, particularly people who might be connected to different poetry circles in Buffalo, a home library of poetry titles. Now, because of the nature of what we do, we're always researching gaps in our collection, books we didn't find along the way, books that might be available now, but only on expensive use markets, or books that we can't find anywhere that we know we don't have. So we're always taking donations of materials, of gently used poetry books and other kinds of materials. If we don't have them in our collection, we catalog them and we fill in that gap. And if we do have them, then we monetize them by selling them as part of local book fairs. So either way, the poetry collection benefits from that kind of donation. One can also make various kinds of monetary gifts to our individual funds and our annual fund. So you'll see an envelope by your placemat there that lists some of our funds to which you can support. And every fall, we do a large appeal at the end of the year. Special projects. We've had many people who over the years have wanted to make their own contributions to what we do by adopting a publisher or by adopting certain books. Now I should say that because we collect so comprehensively, much of what we collect is very expensive. There are individual volumes of poetry that get published in any year that are as much as $12,000 each. These are limited edition books. These are done by fine press printers, letterpress, handmade paper, and essentially they're made for collections like ours to buy. Oftentimes they're used to support other collections. But those books from the 30s and 40s are now some of the most collectible books for museums and exhibitions to have. So we're looking for people to adopt presses. If you want to adopt a publisher, we can help you do that in terms of purchasing all the books that that publisher makes. We have various different kinds of student projects. If I haven't mentioned this earlier, like our grant projects, we oftentimes work with graduate students from both the English department and the library science school that's here on campus. So not only are we getting wonderful work from these students, but we're putting them in a situation where they're getting some kind of educational value for the work and real-world experience. And from what we've seen, it's really the students with that kind of hands-on concrete experience, they're the ones that first get hired when they're applying for jobs because they've done the work. More recently, we've been looking to think about ways of endowing our individual collections, like the Riker collection. Ideally, every one of our manuscript collections would be endowed to support its long-term sustainability. Again, I don't know if that will be possible, but that is one of our goals. And lastly, we can be supported for various different kinds of bequests and planned giving. We have a number of people who have a poetry collection listed in their wills, and we work with some individuals on setting up CGAs, Certified Gift Annuities. And of course, I'd be more than happy to talk with you about any of these opportunities individually. So, what do I want you to leave with here today? Well, hopefully I've been able to give you a sense of who we are and what we do, both in the historical sense of where we come from, and the contemporary sense of how we're serving the literary communities of today. But I also want you to leave with an invitation. How many of you have never been to the poetry collection, either on South Campus or now North Campus? Well, we should change that. We are up the loop, as they say, on Flint. We are inside Silverman Library on the 4th floor of Capon Hall, Capon 420. We're open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. There's always some kind of exhibition going on in our space. We have a research room. Unfortunately, it's not as grand as the research room on South Campus, but